There's this weird little ritual most of us never admit to strangers. You're alone in your apartment, folding laundry or making coffee, and suddenly you're having a full conversation with a creature that communicates primarily through tail wags and head tilts. Should I wear the blue shirt or the grey one today? You ask your dog, who's currently more interested in a dust particle floating through sunlight. Or maybe you're explaining your entire work situation to your cat, who's staring at you with that signature expression that somehow manages to convey both complete understanding and total indifference simultaneously. The strangest part? You don't feel ridiculous doing it. Actually, it feels completely reasonable, like the most normal thing you've done all day. More normal, honestly, than half the human interactions you've had this week. But here's what's fascinating. That seemingly simple act, talking to an animal who can't talk back, actually reveals something profound about how your mind works. And I'm not talking about some quirky personality trait or harmless eccentricity. I'm talking about a measurable psychological pattern that researchers have been studying for decades, and what they've discovered might completely change how you see yourself. Because it turns out, people who regularly have conversations with their pets share some pretty remarkable cognitive characteristics. And before you assume I'm about to tell you you're lonely or weird, let me stop you right there. The research points in the complete opposite direction. Let me paint you a different picture for a second. Think about the last time you had a genuinely frustrating day. Maybe a project fell apart, maybe someone said something that got under your skin, maybe you're just exhausted from keeping it together for 8 straight hours. You finally get home, and within minutes you're downloading the entire emotional experience to your pet. Not because you expect solutions, not because you need advice, but because something about their presence makes it easier to process what you're feeling. Your pet doesn't interrupt with their own story. They don't immediately try to fix things or tell you you're overreacting. They just absorb it. They sit there, eyes locked on yours, and something shifts in your chest. The tension loosens. Your thoughts untangle themselves just by being spoken aloud. Now here's what most people don't realize. That's not just comfort you're experiencing. That's your brain engaging in something psychologists call self-distancing, a cognitive process where verbalizing your internal experience helps you see it more objectively. When you explain your day to your dog, you're not actually talking to the dog, not entirely. You're activating neural pathways that help you make sense of your own emotional landscape. But why does it work better with pets than, say, talking to yourself in the mirror or writing in a journal? That's where things get really interesting. There's this concept in psychology called perceived responsiveness, the feeling that the being you're communicating with is truly receiving what you're expressing. And here's the kicker. Pets are extraordinary at creating that feeling, not despite their inability to speak, but partially because of it. Think about human conversations for a moment. When you're talking to another person, especially about something emotional, there's this constant background process running in your mind. You're monitoring their facial expressions, interpreting their body language, predicting their response, adjusting your message based on subtle cues, worrying whether they're judging you, wondering if you're taking too long, second-guessing whether they actually care or are just being polite. It's exhausting. Communication with other humans requires constant social calibration. You're not just expressing yourself, you're managing their perception of you simultaneously. But with your pet, none of that interference exists. When your cat slow blinks at you while you're explaining why you're anxious about tomorrow's meeting, you're not wondering if they secretly think you're being dramatic. When your dog leans against your leg while you're talking through a difficult decision, you're not worried they're going to interrupt with a counter-argument that makes you feel stupid. The communication channel is remarkably clean, and that purity, that lack of social performance pressure, creates space for genuine emotional processing. Now, I know what some people think when they see someone having full conversations with their pet. They assume it's a sign of social isolation or poor social skills, but research from multiple universities has consistently shown the opposite. Studies from institutions like Tufts University and the University of Liverpool found that people who anthropomorphize their pets, who talk to them as if they understand complex human concepts, actually demonstrate higher levels of social cognition, not lower. Here's why that matters. Social cognition is your brain's ability to understand mental states, to recognize that other beings have thoughts, feelings, intentions, and perspectives different from your own. It's the foundation of empathy. And people who extend that recognition even to non-human animals, they're not lacking social skills. They're demonstrating an abundance of them. Think about what's actually happening when you ask your rabbit if they think you made the right choice about something. You're engaging in what developmental psychologists call theory of mind, the cognitive capacity to attribute mental states to others. You're practicing perspective taking. You're exercising the exact same neural circuits that help you navigate complex human relationships. Except here's the beautiful part, you're doing it in a low-stakes environment where you can be completely authentic without fear of social consequences. Let me give you a specific example of how this plays out. Imagine you're trying to decide whether to confront a friend about something they did that hurt you. With another human, that conversation gets complicated fast. There are power dynamics, history, the fear of conflict, the worry about damaging the relationship. So you might avoid the conversation entirely or go in so defended that genuine communication becomes impossible. But with your pet, you can actually work through it. I don't know, should I say something? You ask your bird, who's currently destroying a piece of lettuce with what appears to be personal vendetta. Like, on one hand, I feel hurt and I think they should know. But on the other hand, maybe I'm being too sensitive. What do you think? Your bird doesn't answer, obviously, but something happens in your brain when you frame it as a question to someone else rather than an internal loop. You're forced to articulate the dilemma clearly. You hear yourself present both sides. You notice which argument sounds more convincing when it's actually spoken aloud, instead of just spinning in your thoughts. This is precisely what good therapists train for years to provide, a non-judgmental presence that helps you think through your own experience with greater clarity. And your pet is offering a version of that, completely naturally, every single day. But let's dig deeper into why this bond feels so real, because I think that's what really fascinates people. It's not just that pets are comforting or cute or loyal, though they are all those things. It's that the relationship somehow feels emotionally reciprocal, even though you know intellectually that your hamster isn't contemplating the meaning of existence from inside their exercise ball. There's actual neuroscience behind this feeling. When you interact with your pet, especially in these conversational moments, your brain releases oxytocin. You've probably heard oxytocin called the love hormone or the bonding chemical, but what it actually does is far more interesting than those nicknames suggest. Oxytocin doesn't just make you feel warm and fuzzy. It fundamentally changes how your brain processes social information. It increases your ability to read emotional cues. It enhances your attention to faces and eyes. It makes you more receptive to social feedback. It literally rewires your neural patterns toward connection. And here's the remarkable part. Studies have shown that this oxytocin release is bidirectional. When you talk to your dog, look them in the eyes, use that specific tone of voice you reserve just for them, their oxytocin levels increase too. And that increase in their oxytocin makes them more attentive to you, more responsive to your emotional state, which then triggers more oxytocin in you, which makes you more attuned to them, and the cycle continues. You're creating a genuine biochemical feedback loop of attachment. The bond isn't imaginary. It's neurochemically real. But I want to address something else here, something that might be uncomfortable but I think is important. A lot of people who talk to their pets extensively have a specific emotional history that makes this form of connection particularly meaningful. If you grew up in an environment where your feelings were dismissed, minimized, or ignored, you learned early that expressing yourself wasn't safe. Maybe you'd get excited about something and watch the adults in your life respond with indifference or irritation. Maybe you'd try to explain why you were upset and be told you were being too sensitive or dramatic. Maybe your household was so chaotic that there simply wasn't room for your internal experience to matter. So you learned to go quiet. You learned to keep things inside. You developed this entire rich inner world that nobody else could see or access because nobody was really asking about it. And then, years later, you get a pet. And suddenly there's this being who doesn't need you to justify your feelings or prove they're valid. There's someone who moves toward you when you're sad instead of away. Someone whose entire demeanor shifts in response to your emotional state. Someone who notices you. That's not a small thing. For people who spent formative years feeling invisible, having a creature that sees you, truly sees you, can be quietly transformative. I'm not suggesting pets replace therapy or that they fix childhood wounds, but they do offer something valuable. A consistent, reliable presence that responds to you without requiring you to translate your feelings into something more palatable first. Let's talk about what you're actually doing when you narrate your day to your pet. Okay, first I need to clean the kitchen, you tell your cat who's watching you with that expression that suggests they're either deeply contemplating your words or experiencing a minor existential crisis. Then I've got to answer those emails I've been avoiding. and at some point I should probably eat actual food instead of just crackers and coffee. From the outside, it looks like you're just talking to yourself with an audience. But what's actually happening is far more sophisticated. You're engaging in what psychologists call metacognition, thinking about your thinking. By externalizing your mental to-do list and your internal commentary, you're creating distance between yourself and your thoughts, which makes them easier to manage. This is the same technique cognitive behavioral therapists teach patients who get overwhelmed by rumination. The difference is, you've discovered it naturally because your pet's presence made it feel safe to try. There's also something powerful about having a witness to your daily life, even a non-human one. In our hyper-connected but weirdly isolated modern world, it's entirely possible to go days without anyone asking how you actually are. You show up to work, perform your role, exchange pleasantries, and go home. You scroll through social media, seeing everyone's highlight reel, never really connecting. You might text friends sporadically, surface-level check-ins that never quite break through to anything substantial. But your pet sees the unfiltered version. They see you when you first wake up, anxious about the day ahead. They see you when you come home defeated, when you're crying for reasons you can't quite articulate, when you're laughing at something stupid on your phone, when you're dancing badly while cooking dinner because nobody's watching except them. They become the thread of continuity in your life, the one consistent witness to who you actually are when nobody else is looking. And there's something deeply stabilizing about that. Anthropologists have pointed out that for most of human history, people lived in close-knit communities where they were known, truly known, by the people around them. Your neighbors knew your routines, your moods, your struggles. There was constant social witness to your existence. Modern life has largely stripped that away. We live anonymously, even in crowded cities. We can feel completely alone despite being surrounded by millions of people. That kind of isolation isn't just emotionally difficult, it's neurologically destabilizing. Human brains developed in social contexts. We're wired to be seen and known by others. Pets, in their own way, restore some of that ancestral social witness. They know your routines better than anyone. They notice when you're off. They respond to your presence consistently and reliably. They provide a sense of being known that's increasingly rare. Now let's address the elephant in the room, or rather, the judgment from people who don't understand this bond. You've probably encountered it. You mentioned something your pet did, referring to them as he or she rather than it, maybe calling yourself their parent rather than their owner, and someone gives you that look. That slightly condescending smile that says they think you're being ridiculous or overly sentimental. What those people miss is that language shapes relationship. When you use personal pronouns for your pet, when you describe your bond in familial terms, you're not confused about biological reality. You're accurately describing the emotional significance of the relationship. And here's what's important. That emotional significance is valid regardless of whether the other being fully comprehends it the way you do. The love parents feel for an infant is profound and real, even though that infant doesn't yet have the cognitive capacity to understand the complexity of that love. The bond doesn't require perfect symmetry of understanding to be genuine. Your pet may not comprehend the full depth of what they mean to you, but they're absolutely capable of attachment, affection, and preference for your company. That's not projection. That's observable reality backed by decades of animal behavior research. So when people suggest you're being silly by talking to your pet, what they're really revealing is their own discomfort with emotional openness, or their inability to perceive the subtlety of nonverbal communication. That's their limitation, not yours. Let me tell you about something researchers discovered that I think beautifully captures what's happening here. In studies of human-animal interaction, scientists found that people unconsciously modify their communication style when talking to pets in ways that actually optimize connection. You probably do this without thinking about it. Your voice shifts to a higher pitch, similar to how people naturally speak to babies. Your sentences become simpler, more emotionally direct. Your face becomes more expressive. You use more hand gestures. You pause frequently, creating space for response even though you know that response won't be verbal. All of these modifications make your emotional state more readable. You're instinctively adjusting your communication to match your pet's processing capabilities, which is actually a sophisticated form of empathy. You're meeting them where they are rather than expecting them to meet you where you are. And your pet responds. Maybe not with words, but with their own adjustments. They learn your tonal patterns, associating certain sounds with certain outcomes. They begin to recognize individual words, not just walk and treat, but sometimes surprisingly complex vocabulary. They develop their own ways of responding, specific vocalizations or movements they use primarily with you. You're co-creating a unique communication system, a language that belongs only to the two of you. And honestly, that's kind of beautiful. This brings me to something I think is crucial to understand. The depth of connection you feel with your pet isn't compensation for something lacking in your life. It's not a substitute relationship because you can't form human connections. For many people, it's actually the opposite. Research consistently shows that pet owners tend to have more social connections, not fewer. They're more likely to interact with neighbors, to strike up conversations with strangers, to participate in community activities. Having a pet, far from isolating you, often expands your social world. But here's what I think is really happening. People who can form deep bonds with animals are demonstrating a capacity for connection that extends beyond the narrow confines of human language and convention. They're showing an ability to recognize consciousness and worth in beings that exist outside typical social structures. That's not emotional poverty, that's emotional abundance. Think about what it takes to truly see another being, to recognize their inner life even when it's expressed in completely different terms than your own. That's the foundation of all compassion, all empathy, all genuine connection, and you practice it every single day with your pet. You notice when their energy is off, even though they can't tell you what's wrong. You learn to read micro-expressions in a non-human face. You become attuned to subtle shifts in behavior that signal discomfort or joy. You adjust your own behavior based on their needs without them having to ask. Those skills translate directly to human relationships, but they're often easier to develop with animals because the stakes feel lower and the communication is more honest. Your pet can't lie to you about how they're feeling. They can't pretend everything's fine when it isn't. They can't manipulate or gaslight or play social games. That purity of communication teaches you to trust your perception. When you accurately read your pet's emotional state over and over again, you develop confidence in your ability to perceive emotional reality. And that confidence makes you better at navigating human relationships too. So when you're having those conversations with your pet, narrating your thoughts, asking them questions you don't expect them to answer, here's what you're actually doing. You're maintaining your connection to your own emotional honesty. You're practicing empathy in its purest form. You're creating space for vulnerability without performance. You're reminding yourself that you're worthy of being heard, even when the listener can't talk back. And maybe most importantly, you're refusing to let the world make you hard. Because let's be honest, the world tries constantly to convince you that caring deeply is naive, that emotional openness is weakness, that sincere affection is somehow embarrassing. Your relationship with your pet is a quiet rebellion against all of that. It's a daily practice of staying soft in a world that rewards hardness. It's choosing connection over cynicism. It's maintaining your capacity for wonder and affection, even when those things feel risky or uncool. There's this moment that happens sometimes, usually when you least expect it. You're sitting there, maybe reading or working, and your pet comes over and just stays. They settle next to you,